On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Russia and the U.S. suspend the INF Treaty. Is global security on the brink? And to wrap up our special series, an updated vision. What are the strategic implications of the Belt and Road Initiative?
The most important thing should be understood that China is providing a new alternative for any developing countries to get much more developed.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. The U.S. and Russia announced their official withdrawal from the INF Treaty earlier this month, but it will still be discussed at the 55th Munich Security Conference, which takes place from Friday to Sunday this week. China and the U.S. are reportedly sending their largest ever delegations since the conference inception in 1963. Will dialogue help stabilize the global order or expose divergences that cannot be reconciled? Let's take a look at this first.
The largest annual security conference of its kind will take place on Friday in Munich. According to the chairman of the Munich conference, Wolfgang Ischinger, this year's event will have three main topics: the future of transatlantic ties, the self-assertion of the EU, and the danger of escalating great power rivalries. He was referring to China, the US, and Russia. Political Bureau member Yang Jiechi will be the most senior official China has ever sent to this conference. The U.S. delegation includes big names like Vice President Mike Pence and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Russia is sending its foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, who is expected to meet with the head of NATO Jens Stoltenberg on Friday to discuss the INF Treaty, which Europe wants to save.
We continue to call on Russia to come back into compliance in this 6-month period where they still can do so, saving the treaty, which will be of great importance for all of us.
According to the U.S. and its European allies, Russia's latest cruise missile violates the terms of the arms control deal.
The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd.
But as Russia firmly refutes the accusation, it's unclear how the INF can be salvaged. Putin says he will not get into an arms race with the U.S., but Russia's response will mirror American actions. Neither has been shy to flex its military muscles in the past year. In 2018, Russia launched its largest military drill since the Cold War with China's participation. NATO also kicked off its largest maneuver since the Cold War amid Russia's protest. In an effort to strengthen solidarity with Europe, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is visiting Central Europe with stops in Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. Back to the host country, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she wanted to work very hard to preserve and develop multilateral structures at the Munich Security Conference, but the question is, how?
For more on a post-INF Treaty world, and more importantly, what's happening with the transatlantic relations, with us in Brussels, we have Jamie Shea, who is a senior fellow with Friends of Europe. He's also former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of Emerging Security Challenges at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. In Berlin, we have Hans Moll, Senior Distinguished Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. In Boston, the U.S., Jim Walsh, a Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. And in Beijing, China, we have Teng Jianchun, Director for the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the four of you. Certainly, we have a very strong panel for a very important topic. First of all, may I go to Mr. Walsh? We see this year is a big year for transatlantic relations. 70th anniversary of NATO. Also, 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. A lot of things are happening, but many really wonder, what is now the nature of relations for the cross-Atlantic countries?
Well, I think they're poor. Now, I've been to security conferences like the Munich conference where all the NATO folks get together and say, NATO's never been stronger. We have a new communique that has really strong language. We have these exercises that are really big. But that ignores the fact that what underpins the relationship is the relations between President Trump and the European leaders, between the United States and Europe. And those relations are poor. The President repeatedly speaks in public in disdainful ways about NATO, criticizes NATO, criticizes individual leaders, seems to show no interest in the alliance, and in this case, as he has elsewhere, has acted unilaterally, whether that's the Paris Peace Accord or the Iran nuclear deal, or now the INF. Now, I think Russia is violating the INF, but there are different ways to handle this, and certainly one way to handle it is to consult with your European allies before you go off and make a big announcement. So I think there are some problems here.
Well, you said with one adjective, poor. Mr. Shea, is that also the adjective you would like to choose?
No, frankly, I wouldn't, and I've been a direct participant in hundreds of NATO meetings between Europeans, Canadians and Americans over the last few years, so I've really seen the transatlantic relationship in action. And indeed, you've just had, you mentioned it in your opening section, the Vice President Pence, the Secretary of State Pompeo visiting an important NATO ally in Poland just yesterday, and making it clear in multiple statements that the United States is fully committed to NATO, to the defense of NATO territory, vis-à-vis a possible challenge from Russia. And yes, there are some statements from time to time. They mainly concern, however, not the loyalty to NATO, which I think is very clear. In fact, in the last couple of days in the United States, we've had several moves in the US Congress, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives, which have overwhelmingly, Republicans and Democrats, and I mean overwhelmingly, emphasized the United States commitment to NATO. The problem is more, which is a classic NATO problem, which is burden sharing, which is the United States spends a good deal of the budget and the Europeans don't spend enough. But if you just allow me one final comment in this opening round, you do see that the Europeans realize now that they need to rebalance NATO, and they have added over $40 billion to collective NATO budgets over the last 3 years. And at the end of next year, that will be $100 billion extra dollars. So I think the thing that President Trump is really focused on, which is not so much NATO, but the burden sharing issue, is now being addressed by the European allies. And the United States is putting more and more dollars and more troops into the defense of Europe. So I don't
Mr. Moe, I need to have another speaker come in rather than a dominating voice in this discussion. I'm sorry, Mr. Shea. Mr.
Excuse me.
Yes. Mr. Moe, please help us to understand from your perspective. I mean, earlier Mr. Shea talked about the Secretary of State visiting Europe to the European nations, try to reassure the NATO members, but obviously you heard also different voices coming from Washington suggesting, let's just take care of the new Europe rather than the old Europe, because obviously the old Europe, quote unquote, are having a different thought. What do you think? Is it?
Well, my answer to your initial question would be NATO is both strong and in problems. So I'm sort of somewhat in between.
You're sitting on the fence.
NATO is very strong in the sense of the underlying ties.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sitting not on the fence, but in between.
Okay, there we go.
This is not necessarily on the fence, though it can be on the fence. No, but seriously speaking, I mean, I think the underlying ties which bind together the two halves of the Atlantic world, transatlantic relations, are, continue to be very strong. And we should not forget that Donald Trump is not the representative of America alone. I mean, there's more to the United States policies than Donald Trump alone. But if you take the executive branch, in particular the president, cooperation within NATO has been very complicated and has been significantly disturbed. And frankly, I also don't agree that this is just a normal crisis for NATO. This is a situation of a kind which we haven't had before, and a crisis which we haven't had before. And the epicenter of that crisis, it seems to me, is in the White House in Washington.
Interesting argument there. So You got so many different views already illustrated in our wonderful panel. So, Mr. Tang, obviously, you're only observing from afar, but China also plays a big role in international issues these days. So, as a Chinese scholar, how are you observing the evolving situation, let's just say, about transatlantic relations?
First, we should say we have already entered a new era. That is, say,
which means what?
A new era of major powers strategic competition. This is not an era of fighting against terrorism, as you know. We have witnessed in the recent years.
So you are saying even between the European countries and the United States,
so
it's a
the United
competition?
States, China, and Russia now have already become the competitor and the strategic competitor. And under such circumstances, I'm sure each country would like to prepare in a large, region or long, region to see their security, to see the cooperation. And if you look at the recent, large-scale military drills by Russia in the last year, and also by NATO members last year, you can see these war games actually were under the background of comprehensive or large war with the use of nuclear weapons. And so this is a new era we have already entered into.
So you are saying there could be possibility also of arms race, because we are looking at, I don't want to feed words into your mouth, but if you are looking at the apparent decision to withdraw from INF, first of all, from the United States, and then Russia reportedly said that it is in reaction to the U.S. withdrawal. So are you suggesting there's, as a result of strategic competition, certainly likely to be an arms race? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think there should be a real arms race among major powers, but the competition is not only in military, not only in weapon system, but in some other areas. For example, the economic competition, the geopolitical competition, which require any country from each side to give their all consent to these issues.
Mr. Shea, you see the U.S. and also NATO, for example, and countries in Europe, which of course they are covering different areas, not only on the issue of what's likely to be the funding for NATO, but also on issues like trade. That's, even though a smaller scale, but certainly that's already something souring the relationship, as some say. Meanwhile, you also have this difference, as we mentioned earlier, between the so-called New Europe and the Old Europe, which the U.S. feels differently about. So, and also feels differently when it comes to the complication of building alliances with. So, Mr. Shea, how complicated to you is the picture?
Well, I certainly think it's more complicated than sometimes we see from headlines. For example, I don't personally believe that the United States is less committed to old Europe and is now only favouring new Europe. For example, the United States now sends Marines regularly to Norway, which is certainly part of Western Europe. It has a very strong defence relationship with my own country, the United Kingdom. France and the United States cooperate very closely in counter-terrorism operations in Syria and in the Sahel, in Mali. And indeed, the United States is investing now heavily, not just in putting rotational forces in Poland or in Eastern Europe, but in recreating across the Atlantic into Western Europe the American Second Fleet and now new sea lines of communication. So I don't think the United States, when it looks at NATO, sort of differentiates between good guys and bad guys. I think it recognizes that the unity of the whole is absolutely core to NATO's credibility.
The ever-increasing possibility of U.S. military presence, more of it, inside Europe is certainly an issue rising up recently, particularly with Pompeo's visit to the Central European countries. Mr. Walsh, I also want to invite you your insight on this. There are a lot of talks about increasing of missiles being stationed inside Europe coming from the U.S. Talks about, despite of the differences, but the U.S. increase its military presence through NATO. What do you think about this mixed discussion There are messages coming from here, this side. There are also messages coming from exactly the opposite side. Are we in a confusion? Is the U.S. in a very clear vision, sir, about what to do with the European counterparts? Sorry for a loaded question, but I think these are important aspects of the same question.
Well, again, I think there are some real issues here. The media reporting strongly suggests that the president has questioned whether the U.S. should be in NATO, and has not done so not once, not twice, but several times in White House discussions. We've never had a president who did that before. Now, as we talk about Europe, I don't expect, I think it's terrible that INF seems to be slipping away. I think there's a whole architecture here that has helped provide stability and peace for decades. But I do not expect that if INF were to go away, that Russia would immediately embark on a missile race. It really can't afford another arms race. That's really not in its self-interest. So I don't expect that, and I don't know that the Europeans are going to be really, or at least the European public, is going to be very excited about having new missiles based in Europe, because those, of course, become targets for Russia. And if you go back to the origins here, how did we get here? It was Ronald Reagan. It was the mid-1980s. There were protests across Europe involving hundreds of thousands of people, the birth of the Freeze movement. This was all over the issue of putting new missiles in Europe. And so we'll have to take the temperature, but I doubt many Europeans are very excited about that prospect. Well, but I don't expect it to sort of just zoom up to missile racing. It's bad, though. I think we tear down these pillars, these regimes, whether it's New START or INF or other international agreements, we tear them down at our peril. We don't appreciate how important they are until they're gone, and then it's too late. So I hope we all find a way back here. Russia has definitely violated the INF, but there are more ways to solve this than simply picking up our toys and going home.
Right. The relations with Russia is another complicated issue. We would rather exclude that issue in our discussion today, because we cannot contain so many things in the same debate. But Mr. Ma, let me go to you about the complications here as well. According to Mr. Gorbachev, of course, who has been a big name if you look at the past history 30 years ago, he talked about the INF Treaty, once being scrapped off, it's marking the start of all the achievements being reached throughout the Cold War and also at the end of the Cold War in order to guarantee security in the region, whether between the former Soviet Union and the West, or in Europe and also the United States. So, Mr. Ma, as someone from Germany, there seems to be a very careful choice that countries like yours have to make now when you face strategic issues and possibilities like this.
Yes, indeed. This is not an easy situation for German diplomacy, and this is fully recognized. And I have sympathy for the assessment by Mikhail Gorbachev when he says that both achievements, if I understand him rightly, achievements made during the Cold War in terms of arms control and limitations of arms racing, and at the end of the Cold War in terms of building bilateral treaties which allowed disarmament to some extent, that both these achievements now are under risk. I think this is the case, this is so, and as Jim just indicated, I would agree with that view. We are not just talking about the INF Treaty. No. We are talking about a pillar of arms control agreements whose destruction will endanger other pillars of arms control, such as the New START agreement, which is now greatly uncertain, it seems to me. It's going to run out in 2021, and it seems unlikely that something will follow. And also, I think we have to think of the nuclear non-proliferation regime here. Again, that seems to be something which is now looking pretty shaky. So it's not only about the INF. And one of the paradoxes, of course, is anyway that a lot of people are scratching their heads and trying to find out what Russia exactly has in mind with those cruise missiles, because it has so many other weapon systems which can threaten Europe, not least, air-based or sea-based cruise missiles. So why have they decided to develop this system and do it in a way which clearly breaches the INF Treaty? Right. It's a puzzle, but the puzzle is part of a much larger picture. you know, we talked before about an arms race. I think we are, I don't know whether you call it an arms race, but an arms build-up has been going on for quite some time.
Mr. Tong, the three other speakers,
you know, we are confronting a situation where technological advances in armaments.
Yeah. The three earlier speakers have beautifully illustrated the complex situation that they each individually face and also collectively for this transatlantic relationship face. Now, you explained earlier, this is a time when many factors are fluid. They're also moving toward against, you know, in different factions toward one another. So, Mr. Tong, how do you understand some of the options that the transatlantic relationship is facing right now as a Chinese security scholar?
There are a lot of uncertainties.
Give me some of the points that you are looking at.
For example, the relations between the United States and France and Germany. You know, today the Middle East conference are being held in Poland, and the foreign ministers from these two countries, you know, didn't appear there. And the British foreign minister just attended the opening ceremony yesterday. So this is
you also see the argument through the Hungary foreign minister and also Mr. Pompeo, which is very different from Polish tone toward Mr. Pompeo. So a lot of differences, different voices.
So the withdrawal of INF Treaty by the United States will give a very negative you know, impact on the relations across the Atlantic Ocean, because the United States might say this is a good choice for the United States, but this is a bad choice for the European countries. And as a result, I think such a treaty actually is, you know, from the, you know, effort made not only by the former Soviet Union and then the United States, it's also an effort by the European countries. And, you know, at that time, the Chancellor of Western Germany gave a great contribution to such agreement or treaty between the two superpowers in the Cold War time.
As complicated as it is, Mr. Shea, that's why they try to figure it out through the upcoming Munich Security Conference. One of the biggest topics is transatlantic relations. But there are two possibilities, I say, sir. One is that, well, maybe different sides express their views and they try to come to consensus and they manage to a certain extent. But there could also be the possibility different sides express their opinions and they are going directly against one another or in very different divergent ways. Sir, when you see that intellectual debate, shall I say, academic and security debate, what's likely to be the tone from your perspective?
Well, I think there's a lot of frank talking across the Atlantic, and that's no bad thing. You've got to remember, NATO is an alliance of democracies, 29, nearly 30 democracies, and it's the habit of democracies that they have their own views and that they have to debate and achieve consensus. But the one thing about NATO, and I was there for nearly 39 years, so I witnessed this over many generations, is that even after the most difficult debates, NATO always agrees in the end and finds consensus, because I generally believe that we're held together by common democratic values, and the things that unite us, all of those threats that we've been talking about today and challenges, always are greater than the factors that divide us. So I don't necessarily see that frank talking as a sign of weakness. As a NATO historian, the first book I read about the crisis in NATO was, believe it or not, was published in 1962. So yes, we have had lots of debates over the years, that's key. And as I said, one of the key ones at the moment is this burden-sharing debate, which requires the Europeans to spend more and to spend better. But you know, again, you know, if you look at an iceberg, the most significant part is the 3/4 that is under the ocean. It's the part you don't see, and sometimes you only focus on that little tip of the iceberg above the water. My sense is that we will come out of it united.
1962. That's the first book when we see Mr. Shea, the one that was published in 1962 about crisis in NATO. But of course,
predicting NATO's imminent demise. Yes.
Yes, it's very different. One could argue 1962,
of my death are greatly exaggerated,
which is 20 years, almost 20 years after the Second World War, and today when the world is changing in such a dramatic way. Before we go, Mr. Mao, I also want to have another European voice to wrap it up. Your thought here.
About the future of the transatlantic relationship?
About the
Yes,
Munich Security Council and
I
on
think
that
first
topic
of all,
briefly.
I would not make this simple. On the future of the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah.
That's the question here, right?
Yes.
Yes. I think we will not see much agreement between the Europeans and among the Europeans themselves, indeed, and the United States coming out of Munich. This is an occasion for people to just exchange views, frankly, and cooperation is going to be very difficult. But let me also point out that the division of Europe into an old Europe and a new Europe is really misleading. It's more complicated than that, and you have sort of coalitions on different issues all the time.
That's right.
Some countries are very hawkish on Russia, others are very positively disposed towards Russia, and those include old and new European member countries. So that distinction is not terribly helpful. Overall, I think what you're going to see in the longer run and beyond the Munich Security Conference is that the increasing pressure coming from Russia on NATO and on the European Union is going to produce more unity and more cooperation.
Well, we'll see what's going to happen, whether predictions are really the realities for the future. Thank you so much, the four of you, for joining us. Jamie Shea, Hans Mo, Jim Walsh, last but not least, Teng Jianxun. Really appreciate the gentlemen for being with us. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. To wrap up our special series and updated vision, what are the strategic implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, and what is the relations among countries in South and Southeast Asia? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. The Belt and Road Initiative is being brought to the world in a new era of globalization. The need to act in times of transition is as relevant as ever. How does the BRI fit into the new world order, or the ever-changing picture of how the development is being done on a global basis? In today's episode of our special series, An Updated Vision, we review China's diplomatic strategies, but more importantly, how countries along the Belt and Road Initiative will be able to work together for their win-win situation. We talked to Hu Shisheng, Director of the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Let's listen in. Competition of ideas and roadmaps among some of the major players of the world in the region. Indo-Pacific, for example, Belt and Road, and the list goes on. Mr. Hu, how do you see the competition between these apparently strategic ideas? What does that mean for us?
Any country during the rising process, I think that they have their own promotion of their own ideology, own initiative, or own contribution to the big, to a larger instance that is a global governance, to the smaller concern that is to regional contribution, or regional governance. So at the present stage, of course, what China can do within its capability is more contribution to regional governance. The area China is located is so geostrategically important because it's congested with so many major powers like U.S. and U.S. allies, and also like an emerging country like India, and also the traditional military power like Russia, and also like the very influential, we call nation group, ASEAN countries. They all have their own rules to play in this region. So when China, during the rising process, want to get respected or accepted by all these key players in the same congested region, China has to make some ideas out of the box. So I personally believe that the Belt and Road Initiative is one of it.
We see the rhetorics related to the Belt and Road, if you look at the headlines of so-called international media, has been really changing dramatically. Is China looking at its original proposal and having a second thought of it? Or is China sticking to its original plan, no matter what the so-called tunes of the stories is in the rest of the world?
And when initiating the Belt and Road plans, the basic purpose for this government is, of course, to sustaining the Chinese economic development for another 30 years or more than 40 years. Because I can label it as a fourth round of liberation of Chinese production forces, or first round of reforms. That is, China has to go abroad. But how to go abroad in a more disciplined way, in a more systematic way? So that is a Belt and Road Initiative will play the role in this regard. But during the process, you can see that this kind of initiative, if we want it to be successful, not only China will win. It should be a win-win situation. It doesn't mean that China will win twice. It means balanced win to all of us. It is only in this kind of circumstances that we can see Belt and Road Initiative can be successful, can also bring more constructive changes to not only to China but also to China's surroundings. That is also why in the past 5 years it become more and more welcome.
How can China and what can China do to make sure that more will have the confidence in the BRI? If there's suspicion about this platform, there's suspicion about China is having the win-win, meaning double win, then there might be hesitation. It's just natural. Mr. Hu.
Of course it is natural, because since that, especially between a giant like China, major power, and also a smaller country, for example, like Sri Lanka or Maldives, there is some suspicion. But the most important thing should be understood that China is providing a new alternative for any developing countries to get much more developed. We know that if in the past, they have some model like WB model, IMF model. All these developing countries tried. They have their own melodies for that. But frankly speaking, none of those developing countries got developed under the IMF remedy or the WB remedy. So now China had put forward another choice. Of course, you cannot make achievement at free cost. There must be some cost, but you have to balance the short-term pain and long-term rewarding. But now that, of course, because of this kind of media hype or Western allegations, the smaller nations, especially some countries under the influence of some major powers, their mind got disturbed by those allegations. They hadn't still understanding in a comprehensive way what is the Chinese philosophy on development.
So what is, Mr. Hu, the biggest issue here? Is it the biggest issue that China needs to more efficiently communicate exactly the goals and the end game and the intentions this country has toward the so-called Belt and Road Initiative? Or is it that there's much bigger than that? What is likely to be the next step, you think, that China is likely to take?
Next, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative have already passed in 5 years. Yes. We have to, at least. Now this year we'll held the second Belt and Road Forum. So we have to study the past cases. We have to study the past 5 years' experiences and lessons. We also have to carefully study the allegations from the developed economies. They also must have some important things inside it. So to learn from the lessons and listen carefully the criticism and allegations from others, so that we can readjust, so that make our future development of Belt and Road Initiative can be stepped in the right direction. Not only benefit China, but also benefit the host countries.
That's the goal, isn't it, as China stated at the very beginning?
Of course, that is the beginning goal. But of course, sometimes you have a very good design, good wish, but during the process of practice, maybe intercourse some differences or difficulties or differences, even some resistance. That is quite natural because no country in this world tried this. Sometimes I just advising my foreign friends, please be patient, give China some time. But why the Westerners are so short-tempered, especially U.S. short-tempered? Because he saw the future end. He saw that China was using this as a platform or springboard for getting a global influence for China. So before China gets becoming successful, he wants to make more troubles.
In China, there is also the debate, Mr. Hu, whether it is cost efficient. I mean, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been putting a lot of investment, and therefore there is a cost efficient question about it. How do you see that question is being played out at a time when the world is transforming and China is searching for its own identity?
Since that this is China's first time in such a larger scale going abroad, and also promoted and policy supported by the government. This is the first time. I think that from the top level, from the governmental level, I don't believe that we have that kind of rich experiences. Or from the private sector, they have experiences in some area, but most of the experiences cannot be copied. So that is why China practicing Belt and Road Initiative in different countries by following different policies. That is also why we will be criticized that, okay, your Belt and Road Initiative, no rule-based. But why we have to follow some rules? Because all the past rules not so successful in helping those areas which now Belt and Road Initiative measuring, passing through. We call it economic development or depression area. So now we have to follow on the ground conditions. And the specific conditions, different conditions, maybe different policies. But we are more result-oriented. Yeah. If it is more efficient, it can bring development benefits, then could be that is okay. But of course, during the process, there must be have to need more adjustment or readjustment during the process.
But they would argue that yes, rule-based system might not be the best choice and the most efficient at any time given. However, they would argue the rule-based system could be one that could prevent, for example, corruption, for example, exploration of the natural resources.
We will have some guiding principles like mutual consultation, right, joint construction, and share the benefits. This is a guiding principle. But how to practice this guiding principle, but different places, different time, there should be some specific different policies. Otherwise, they will be very difficult. For example, INF has saved Pakistan in the past so many years, at least 14 times. But still Pakistan is plugged into or stuck into debt crisis for so many years. Haven't saved that country, haven't solved addressing the rooted causes of the problem. Now what Belt and Road Initiative that we want to address in the basic causes, we're not only helping you, we will mainly focus on helping you to step on your own feet. We're providing a sound basis for your future economic development. But we know that at least the most part of this area covered by the Belt and Road Initiative is not run or governed on market economic rules. So we have to find the Chinese way. We have to building up some pilot projects so that to generate some lessons or to formulate gradually some rules.
But you know, Mr. Hu, here's one thing that is very important we haven't mentioned. That is, China is such a significant country, not only regionally, but also globally, that it becomes such a factor, in a way, in the policy-making process of many countries. Mr. Hu, how do you look at that phenomenon, that China has become such a major player that will have an impact on a lot of countries' own plan for its future?
Of course, China is now is the number 2 major power in the world. So China's policies cannot only have internal influence, must have global influence, and even sometimes become one factor of the other's internal political struggling or even development agenda. So this is quite natural, just like the U.S. We often label U.S. as the neighbors of all countries. So China is moving in that direction. So that means that in the future, whatever China's suggestions or ideas, the policy-making institutions or persons have to take a second thinking what the others will think about it. And then will help us to make a policy that is more comprehensive, more considerated. I think we are moving in that direction, because in the past we never tried. We're just closing our doors or just doing our business. But now it is not only Chinese business. Sometimes your policies really have global impact. So
China, Mr. Hu, according to you, is on a learning curve.
Of course, that even the U.S., even Japan, we know that in the 1970s, last century, in the 1970s, Japan's image in ASEAN countries very bad, very negative. But now, very popular.
Can China be a fast learner?
I think that China is a fast learner, even especially CCP is the most fast learner party in the world, I can say. The success of China's reform is just a result of the learning from others, learning from any kind of experiences in the history, in the present world, from any others which we can learn from. Well, we are keen learner or quick learner, yeah.
Mr. Hu, what a pleasure seeing you. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure too.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.